The air in the Hawthorne cabin was thick and unnervingly still. Deputy Miller stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the cold steel of his pistol, a gesture that offered no comfort against the creeping dread that was coiling in his stomach. It was the silence that was most wrong. A family cabin in the heart of the Tennessee wilderness in 1802 should be alive with noise, the cry of a baby, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of a fire. But here, there was nothing. Only the low moan of the wind seeping through the chinks in the log walls, a sound like a mourner's lament. The scene before him was a macabre portrait of interrupted life. A half-eaten meal of stew and cornbread sat on the rough-hewn table, cold and congealed. 4 plates, 4 chairs. A child's wooden cup was toppled over, a dark stain of spilled milk already crawling with flies. An overturned cradle lay in the corner, its gentle rocking motion stilled, its blankets tangled as if its occupant had been snatched away in a sudden, violent frenzy. This was not a family that had packed and left. This was a family that had vanished. Miller took a hesitant step inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His eyes scanned every dark corner, every shadow that danced in the dim light filtering through the grime-caked windows. He saw the mother's shawl draped over a chair, the father's whittling knife on the mantelpiece, the small, worn-out shoes of their eldest boy by the hearth. These were the ghosts of a life that was present only moments or perhaps hours ago. Then his gaze fell upon the front porch. Resting against the doorjamb was a small, crudely made doll. It was fashioned from dried corn husks, bound together with twine. But its hair was not yarn or straw. It was a tangle of fine, blonde locks unmistakably human, and woven into its husk-entwined dress was a small scrap of blue calico fabric, a pattern he recognized with a sickening jolt. It was from the dress of little Sarah Hawthorne. This was not a clue. It was a threat, a horrifying, silent declaration that something ancient and malevolent had crept out of the surrounding woods and erased an entire family from existence. This disturbing discovery at the Hawthorne cabin was not the beginning of the story. It was the horrifying culmination of a slow-burning curse, a plague of fear that had been poisoning the remote settlement of Hemlock's Notch for over a year. To understand the macabre silence that greeted Deputy Miller, one must go back to the source of the dread, to the moment the first seed of darkness was planted in the community's fertile soil of superstition and piety. Hemlock's Notch in 1802 was a place on the very edge of the known world. Carved out of the dense, unforgiving Appalachian wilderness, it was a pocket of civilization held together by faith, fear, and the unyielding will of its founding families. 2 of these families stood above the rest: the Hawthornes, led by the prosperous and respected patriarch, Thomas Hawthorne, and the Blackwoods, commanded by the iron-fisted and deeply devout Jedediah Blackwood. They were the twin pillars of the community, their fortunes intertwined, their families setting the tone for all social and spiritual matters. They represented order, piousness, and the taming of the wild frontier. But on the outskirts of this fragile society, living in a dilapidated cabin at the edge of the shadowy woods, was a woman who represented the opposite. Her name was Elara Vance. She was a widow, a figure of sorrow and suspicion. A year prior, her husband and infant son had perished in a swift and brutal cabin fire. While the rest of the community saw it as a tragic accident, a testament to the harsh realities of frontier life, whispers followed Elara like a shroud. She was different. She kept to herself, practiced folk remedies learned from her grandmother, and herbalism that the town preacher decried as witchcraft, and she did not grieve in the way a proper Christian widow was expected to. Her sorrow was not loud and public. It was a quiet, simmering thing that made the townsfolk deeply uncomfortable. They saw her not as a victim of tragedy, but as an omen, a dark stain on their righteous community. The isolation they imposed on her only deepened her strangeness, pushing her further into the embrace of the one thing she had left, the whispering, ancient forest at her back. And it was in that forest she would build the monument to her grief, a place that would soon be known only in hushed, terrified tones as the Widow's Chapel. The structure that Alara Vance built was no chapel in any sense that the God-fearing people of Hemlock's Notch would recognize. It was not a house of the Lord. It was a thing born of grief, madness, and the earth itself. Deep within the woods that bordered her property, in a secluded hollow where the sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of leaves, she began to construct her sanctuary. She used no cut lumber, no nails, no tools of civilized construction. Instead, she bent and wove young saplings together, creating a skeletal frame that looked more like the rib cage of some great dead beast than a building. She plastered the walls with a mixture of river mud, clay, and her own hair, a disturbing act of creation that was witnessed by a hunter who fled the woods in a panic. The roof was a thick thatch of moss and pine boughs, causing the interior to be cast in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. There was no cross, no pulpit, no pews. Instead, the small, single room was filled with macabre art. Carved wooden figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs hung from the woven walls. Piles of smooth river stones were arranged in strange, spiral patterns on the packed earth floor. In the center, where an altar should have been, stood a gnarled stump of an ancient oak tree, its surface stained dark with what looked like berry juice, or perhaps something else. This was not a place for prayer. It was a place for incantations. It was a forbidden temple dedicated to forbidden sorrow. The community's suspicion curdled into outright fear. They saw Alara's creation not as an expression of a broken heart, but as a deliberate act of blasphemy, a profane mockery of their own simple wooden church that stood in the center of the settlement. Jedediah Blackwood, from his pulpit, declared it an altar to Satan, a place where the widow communed with the demonic forces that had surely claimed the souls of her husband and child. The widow's chapel became a forbidden zone, a source of terrifying local folklore. Parents warned their children never to stray near the Vance property, lest the witch in the woods snatch them away. The chapel was the physical manifestation of their fear of Alara, of the wilderness, and of the dark, pagan world they believed was constantly trying to reclaim their small patch of consecrated ground. It stood silently in the woods, waiting. And it was from this epicenter of dread that the true curse would finally begin to radiate. The curse began, as such things often do, with the innocence of a child. Sarah Hawthorne, the youngest daughter of Thomas Hawthorne, was a bright, curious girl of 6 with hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. She was beloved by the entire community, a symbol of the purity and promise of Hemlock's Notch. One late summer afternoon, while playing a game of hide-and-seek with her older brothers near the edge of their family's cornfield, Sarah vanished. One moment her laughter echoed through the stalks, the next an unnerving silence fell. At first her brothers thought it was part of the game. They searched for her, their calls growing more frantic as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. When they returned to the cabin without her, the alarm was raised. Thomas Hawthorne organized a search party immediately. Nearly every able-bodied man in Hemlock's Notch, armed with lanterns and rifles, plunged into the encroaching darkness. They combed the fields, the woods, and the banks of the nearby creek, their shouts of Sarah, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. They searched all night and into the next day, their hope dwindling with every passing hour. They found no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a wolf or a bear. It was as if the girl had simply been plucked from the earth. The search party found only one thing. Snagged on a thorny bramble bush, on the faint, barely used trail that led towards the forbidden Vance property and the dreaded widow's chapel, was a single small scrap of blue calico ribbon. It was the very ribbon Sarah had been wearing in her hair that day. The discovery sent a chill through the entire search party. Their fear, once a nebulous unease about the strange widow, now had a focus. It had a name and a face. The path did not lead to a wild animal's den. It led directly towards the source of all their anxieties. Jedediah Blackwood held the ribbon aloft in the failing light, his face a grim mask of certainty. "This is her work," he proclaimed, his voice booming through the silent woods. "The witch has taken her." The curse was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. The disappearance of Sarah Hawthorne transformed the simmering paranoia of Hemlock's Notch into a palpable, collective terror. The scrap of blue ribbon became a holy relic of their fear, passed from hand to hand, each touch imbuing it with more certainty of the widow's guilt. Jedediah Blackwood, a man who saw the world in stark terms of good and evil, God and Satan, became the de facto prosecutor in the court of public opinion. He stood before his congregation that Sunday, his voice thundering with righteous fury, and painted a horrifying picture of Alara Vance. She was not merely a grieving woman. She was a serpent in their Eden, a disciple of darkness who had made a pact with unspeakable forces. The widow's chapel, he roared, was where she had taken the innocent child for some profane, macabre ritual. He called for action, for the men to march to her property and burn that heathen temple to the ground, to purge their community of her evil. However, Sheriff Brody, a pragmatic and stoic man who had seen his share of frontier justice turn into mob-fueled tragedy, urged caution. He argued that there was no proof, only speculation. A ribbon on a path was not a confession. He went to Alara's cabin himself, flanked by two wary deputies. He found her tending her garden, her face calm and impassive. When questioned, she showed no surprise, no fear, only a quiet, unnerving weariness. She denied everything, her voice a low monotone that seemed to carry no emotion at all. She claimed she had not left her property in weeks and had seen no child. The sheriff and his men searched her cabin and the surrounding land. They found nothing. No sign of Sarah, no evidence of any crime. They even approached the dreaded chapel, but a strange, instinctual fear kept them from entering. They peered through the doorway at the creepy effigies and bizarre stone patterns, and a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled deep in their bones. They left with nothing but a profound sense of unease. The lack of evidence did little to quell the town's hysteria. In fact, it made it worse. They now believed Alara was not just evil, but cunning. A witch who could hide her sins with powerful, dark magic. The community was a powder keg, and Jedediah Blackwood was holding the match. He saw the sheriff's inaction as weakness, even complicity, and he was about to take matters into his own hands. Jedediah Blackwood, believing himself to be an instrument of God's wrath, decided to confront the evil himself. He was not a man to be trifled with. His piety was as hard and unyielding as the rocky soil his family farmed. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, he announced to his family that he was going to walk to the edge of the Vance property. He would not trespass, he claimed, but he would stand at the border of her unholy land and pray, casting out the demonic influence with the power of his faith. He forbade anyone from following him, declaring it his own sacred duty. He strode out into the twilight, his Bible clutched in one hand, his face set with grim determination. He did not return that night. As the hours passed, his family's concern grew into panic. At dawn, his eldest son, Samuel, gathered a small group of men to search for him. They followed his path to the edge of the woods that separated the Blackwood farm from the widow's land. There they found signs of a disturbance. The ground was scuffed, the undergrowth trampled. It looked as though a struggle had occurred. But there was no sign of Jedediah. The search continued for 2 days. The fear in Hemlock's Notch reached a fever pitch. First a child from the Hawthorne family, now the patriarch of the Blackwoods. It was as if some malevolent force was systematically targeting the town's leading families, striking at their very heart. On the 3rd day, a pair of hunters found him. Jedediah Blackwood was wandering aimlessly deep in the woods, miles from where he was last seen. His clothes were torn and caked with mud. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have burned out his very soul. He was muttering to himself, his words a nonsensical, terrifying jumble. They brought him back to the settlement, but the man who returned was not the powerful, commanding leader who had left. He was a broken shell, a vessel of madness. He flinched at shadows and cried out in the night. In his brief moments of lucidity, he spoke of horrifying, cryptic things. He whispered of songs from the soil, of a humming beneath the floor of the forest. He spoke of the woman of woven sorrows, whose eyes were old as the stones. Then he would lapse back into incoherent babbling, his sanity completely shattered. He never recovered. The sight of the once mighty Jedediah Blackwood reduced to a raving, terrified madman was more horrifying than another disappearance. It was a living testament to the curse, proof that the widow did not just kill, she destroyed. The descent of Jedediah Blackwood into madness was a turning point. The horror was no longer distant or abstract. It was living and breathing within the walls of the community. His vacant, terrified eyes were a constant, chilling reminder of the evil that lurked just beyond the tree line. The curse now felt targeted, personal, and horrifyingly intimate. It was as if Alara Vance, from her secluded hollow, was methodically dismantling the two families who had been most vocal in their condemnation of her. The Hawthorns had lost their youngest child, a blow to their future. The Blackwoods had lost their patriarch, a blow to their foundation of power and faith. A creeping, insidious paranoia began to seep into the very soul of Hemlock's Notch. The once close-knit community started to fracture. Neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion. Who had spoken ill of the widow? Who had cast a scornful glance her way? Were they next? Doors were bolted at sundown and heavy bars were placed across them. No one ventured out after dark. The cheerful sounds of community life were replaced by an oppressive, watchful silence. Children were kept indoors, their laughter and games vanishing from the dusty main path of the settlement. The curse manifested in other ways, too. A blight took hold of the Hawthorn and Blackwood cornfields, turning the stalks black and rotten, while the fields of other families remained untouched. The Blackwood's prize bull was found dead one morning, with no mark upon it, its eyes wide with the same terror that haunted Jedediah. A litter of piglets was born to the Hawthorn's sow, each one hideously deformed. These events, which might have been dismissed as unfortunate coincidences a few months prior, were now seen as undeniable proof of the witch's power. They were signs, portents of a much darker doom to come. The folklore of the region, full of tales of haints and woodland spirits, was resurrected with new vigor. People began to whisper of seeing strange lights flickering in the woods near the widow's chapel at night. Others claimed to hear faint, disembodied chanting on the wind. Most disturbingly, several people reported finding strange symbols painted on their doors or fence posts in the morning, spirals and stick figures drawn with mud and ash, chillingly similar to the carving seen inside Alara's profane sanctuary. The curse was no longer confined to the woods. It was now creeping into their homes, marking its next potential victims. Sheriff Brody found himself a man adrift in a sea of hysteria. As a representative of the law, he was supposed to be a bastion of reason and order, but his authority was crumbling against the rising tide of supernatural fear. He had no laws against witchcraft, no precedent for investigating a curse. How could he arrest a woman for blighted corn or a stillborn calf? Every logical explanation he offered was dismissed as naivete or worse, as a sign that he himself was somehow under the witch's influence. His investigation into Sarah Hawthorne's disappearance had gone cold. His questioning of the catatonic Jedediah Blackwood yielded nothing but terrifying, poetic nonsense. He was a man fighting shadows, and the shadows were winning. Frustrated and increasingly isolated, Brody dedicated himself to finding a rational explanation, a single piece of tangible evidence that could cut through the fog of superstition. He began to delve into Alara Vance's past, sending letters to the county seat, hopping to find records of her family, of the grandmother from whom she had allegedly learned her herbalism. He spent hours poring over old almanacs and books, searching for information on local plants and fungi, wondering if there was some natural poison, some hallucinogen from the forest floor that could explain Jedediah's madness. His deputies thought he was wasting his time. The townsfolk saw his obsession with books and letters as a foolish distraction from the real threat. They wanted him to grab a torch and a rope, not a quill and ink. His rational approach only made him a target of suspicion. Why was he so determined to prove the widow innocent? The answer, known only to Brody himself, was that the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. If Alara Vance was not a poisoner or a kidnapper, if she was, in fact, what everyone claimed she was, then they were not dealing with a simple criminal. They were facing something that could not be stopped with a gun or put in a jail cell. They were facing an ancient and incomprehensible evil that had taken root in their valley. The stories of dark histories and forbidden folklore are filled with moments like this, where the line between the real and the supernatural becomes so blurred it ceases to exist. If you find these macabre explorations of history's darkest corners compelling, consider subscribing to our channel, because the quiet investigation of Sheriff Brody was about to be rendered completely irrelevant by a horrifying event that would eclipse everything that had come before it. While Sheriff Brody desperately sought a logical answer, the curse continued its methodical, horrifying work. The Hawthorne family, already broken by the loss of their daughter, seemed to be living under a permanent, dark cloud. Thomas Hawthorne, once a robust and confident man, became a ghost of his former self. He rarely spoke, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting some monster to emerge. His wife Mary fell into a deep, unshakable melancholy, often found weeping in Sarah's empty room, clutching one of her daughter's dolls. Their two sons, young men on the cusp of adulthood, grew sullen and fearful, starting at every strange noise in the night. The family that had once been the vibrant center of Hemlock's Notch was now an island of silent, suffocating grief. The community, lost in their own fear, offered little comfort. The Hawthorns were seen as tainted, the primary targets of the witch's ire, and associating with them felt dangerous. The family became utterly isolated, trapped in their sorrow and the palpable dread that clung to their home. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the silence from the Hawthorne cabin became absolute. A neighbor, Josiah Mills, was walking his property line when he noticed the lack of smoke from the Hawthorns' chimney. It was a small detail, but in the rigid routines of frontier life it was a glaring anomaly. A cold fire on a chilly morning meant something was wrong. After hours of watching and waiting, his unease growing with each passing moment, Josiah gathered his courage and walked over to the cabin. He called out Thomas's name. There was no answer. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed unnervingly, met only by silence from within. Hesitantly, he pushed the door open. It was unlocked. The scene that greeted him was the very same one that Deputy Miller would discover 2 days later. The cold, half-eaten meal on the table, the toppled child's cup, the overturned, empty cradle that had once belonged to Sarah, but at that moment it was fresh. The stew in the bowls was not yet congealed. The spilled milk had not yet attracted flies. It was a scene of life interrupted with surgical, terrifying precision. Thomas, Mary, and their two sons were gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry. All their money and valuables were untouched. Their horses were still in the barn, their livestock still in the pen. It was as if the entire family had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world in the time between supper and sunrise. The news of the Hawthorne family's disappearance spread through Hemlock's Notch like a plague. This was no longer a case of a single missing child or a man driven to madness. This was an act of annihilation. An entire family, one of the founding pillars of their community, had been wiped from the map overnight. The last vestiges of rational thought in the settlement evaporated, replaced by raw, primal terror. The townsfolk were convinced this was the curse, horrifying endgame. The witch had finally collected her due, dragging the entire Hawthorne bloodline into whatever hell she served. Deputy Miller's official investigation, which began when he arrived from the county seat 2 days later, was a grim and fruitless affair. He documented the macabre scene at the cabin, his report filled with the chilling details of a life stopped in mid-breath. He paid special attention to the corn husk doll left on the porch. Under close inspection, it was even more disturbing than he had first realized. The human hair woven into its head was not just blonde like Sarah, but also contained strands of brown and gray, matching the hair of Mary and Thomas. The scrap of blue calico from Sarah's dress was stitched to its chest, but now smaller scraps were also present. A piece of checkered wool from one of the boys' shirts, a swatch of lace from Mary's collar. It was a grotesque effigy of the entire vanished family, a totem of their destruction left behind by their tormentor. It was a horrifying signature. The discovery of the doll pushed the community to the brink of total collapse. The Blackwood family, what remained of them, packed their wagons in a desperate panic. Samuel Blackwood, now the head of the family, declared that the land was forsaken, a place given over to evil. He would not wait for the witch to come for his family next. Their departure was a death knell for the settlement. With both the Hawthorns and the Blackwoods gone, the two anchors of the community were lost. The remaining families saw the Blackwoods' flight not as cowardice, but as the only sane response. A quiet but frantic exodus began. Family by family, they loaded what they could carry and fled Hemlock's Notch, abandoning the homes and fields they had worked so hard to build. They were not just leaving a place. They were fleeing a supernatural blight, a curse that could not be fought, only escaped. Sheriff Brody arrived in Hemlock's Notch to find a community in its death throes. The once bustling settlement was now a ghost town in the making, haunted by fear and abandonment. Wagons creaked down the main path, loaded with frantic families who refused to meet his gaze. They were leaving, and nothing he could say would stop them. The air was thick with the smoke of hastily extinguished hearths and the palpable sense of defeat. For Brody, the vanished Hawthorns and the mass exodus were a profound personal and professional failure. He had been unable to stop the panic, unable to find a single piece of evidence to bring the perpetrator, be it witch or mortal, to justice. Now, the crime scene was being abandoned, the witnesses scattering to the four winds. The case was turning cold before his very eyes. The horrifying corn-husk doll was the only tangible clue he possessed. He examined it again and again, convinced it held some key. The craftsmanship was intricate yet crude. The knots were tied with a strange, looping pattern he didn't recognize. The materials, corn husks, twine, human hair, scraps of clothing, were all common, yet their assembly felt ritualistic, deeply personal. It was a work of profound hatred, a macabre trophy. Who would do such a thing? The obvious answer was Elara Vance, but the sheriff's rational mind still rebelled against the idea. How could a lone woman, no matter how cunning, abduct four people from a locked cabin without a single sound or sign of struggle? It defied all logic. It felt like something more than a simple crime. It felt like a story ripped from some forbidden, ancient text. As he stood on the porch of the silent Hawthorne cabin, holding the grotesque doll, a storm began to gather over the mountains. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. A cold wind swept down, rattling the windows of the abandoned homes around him. In that moment, Brody made a decision. He could not let this stand. He could not allow this crime, this evil, to go unanswered. The community may have surrendered to fear, but he would not. He would go to the source of the terror. He would march to the widow's chapel and confront Elara Vance himself. He would get the truth or die trying. The approaching storm felt like an omen, a celestial reflection of the tempest he was about to unleash. Sheriff Brody knew he could not face the darkness at Sorrow's Hollow alone. Despite the mass exodus, a few stubborn settlers remained, men too old, too poor, or too rooted to the land to leave. Among them were Josiah Mills, the neighbor who first discovered the empty Hawthorne cabin, and two grim-faced brothers, the Fenwicks, who had a long-standing and bitter land dispute with the Vance family from before the widow's time. Brody found them huddled in the nearly empty church, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and fury. He laid out his plan. They would not be a mob seeking blind vengeance. They would be a legally deputized posse. They would march to the Vance property not with torches but with the authority of the law. Their purpose was to bring Elara Vance in for questioning regarding the disappearance of the Hawthorne family. If she resisted, they were authorized to use force. It was a fine distinction, but for Brody, it was a crucial one. He was determined to see this through by the book, even if the book had no chapter for dealing with curses that erase entire families. The men agreed, their motivations varied. Josiah Mills felt a sense of duty, a need to see justice for his neighbors. The Fenwick brothers likely saw an opportunity to settle an old score under the guise of the law. Whatever their reasons, they were four men willing to walk into the heart of the storm. As they gathered their rifles and lanterns, the storm broke in full fury. Rain began to lash down, turning the dusty paths of Hemlock's Notch into thick, clinging mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the skeletal trees in brief, horrifying flashes. The wind howled like a banshee, carrying with it the sounds of rattling doors and shutters on the abandoned cabins, making it seem as if the entire ghost town was screaming. The journey to Alara Vance's property was a battle against the elements and their own mounting dread. The path through the woods was treacherous, a river of mud and slick, moss-covered roots. Every crack of thunder sounded like a gunshot. Every flash of lightning twisted the surrounding trees into monstrous, grasping shapes. It felt as though the forest itself was trying to stop them, as if the curse had command over the very wind and rain. They were intruders in a forbidden, malevolent kingdom, and they could feel the unseen eyes of its queen watching them from the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, the four men arrived at the edge of the Vance property. The small, dilapidated cabin where Alara lived stood dark and silent against the storm, looking more like a natural outcropping of the woods than a human dwelling. There was no smoke from the chimney, no light in the window. A deep, primal instinct screamed at them to turn back, but they pressed on, their boots sinking into the mud. Sheriff Brody, his lantern held high, pounded on the cabin door. Alara Vance. "This is Sheriff Brody. Open this door in the name of the law." The only reply was the roar of the storm. He pounded again, harder this time, the wood groaning in protest. When there was still no answer, one of the Fenwick brothers used the butt of his rifle to smash the single, grimy window. Brody cautiously peered inside. The cabin was empty. And it was not just empty of people, it was bare. The sparse furniture was gone, the hearth was swept clean, the shelves were barren. The only things left were dust and the faint, cloying smell of dried herbs and something else, something acrid and unpleasant. It was clear that Alara had fled, but she wouldn't have gone far. Brody knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone where she would be. Their grim procession continued, deeper into the woods towards the place the entire valley feared, the widow's chapel. As they drew closer, a strange phenomenon became apparent. The sound of the raging storm, the wind, the rain, the thunder, began to fade, replaced by a low, monotonous humming sound. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in their chests, a deep, resonant thrum that felt both organic and deeply unnatural. The air grew cold and still. They found the chapel standing in its secluded hollow, an island of eerie calm in the midst of the tempest. The woven, mud-plastered walls seemed to absorb the sound around it. The humming was louder here, emanating from the structure itself, as if it were a living, breathing creature. The door, a crude plank of wood, was slightly ajar, a dark sliver of an invitation into the suffocating blackness within. A faint, flickering light like that of a single candle could be seen from the crack. She was in there. They had found the heart of the darkness, and now they had to step inside. With his heart pounding against his ribs, Sheriff Brody pushed the chapel door open. The low humming intensified, a physical pressure against their ears. The scene inside was a tableau of absolute horror, far worse than any of the whispered rumors had suggested. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and the sickly sweet scent of night-blooming flowers. In the center of the room, a single tallow candle guttered on the gnarled tree stump altar, its weak light casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and threatening. But it was the walls that drew their horrified gaze. Hanging from the woven branches were dozens of effigies. They immediately recognized the grotesque doll representing the Hawthorne family, but it was now joined by others. There was an effigy for Jedediah Blackwood, its face contorted in a silent scream, its eyes made from shards of black glass. There were smaller dolls representing his wife and children. Every single member of the two founding families was represented, each one a macabre puppet crafted from mud, sticks, personal effects, and human hair. It was a gallery of the damned, a visual catalog of the curse's victims, both taken and intended. On the altar next to the candle lay an open book. It was not a Bible but a thick leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant, spidery script. Beside it sat a collection of strange objects, a lock of gray hair tied with a black ribbon, a tarnished silver button from a man's coat, a child's tooth, and several bundles of dried, unfamiliar herbs. But Alara Vance was not there. The chapel was empty of any living soul. As the men stood frozen in shock and revulsion, Josiah Mills let out a choked cry and pointed towards the packed earth floor. "Sheriff, look." At first Brody didn't see it. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light. The floor was not uniform. In the center of the room there was a large, rectangular section where the earth was darker, more loosely packed than the surrounding area. It looked exactly like a freshly dug grave. The horrifying implication hung in the silent, humming air. Had she buried the bodies of the Hawthorns here, beneath the floor of her profane church? The thought that they were standing directly on top of their final resting place was almost too much to bear. The morbid curiosity to know what lay beneath their feet overrode their fear. Leaving one man to stand guard at the door, Sheriff Brody and the others began to dig. They had no shovels, so they used their bare hands and the stocks of their rifles, clawing at the damp, loosely packed earth. The humming sound that permeated the chapel seemed to grow louder, more intense with every scoop of soil they removed, as if they were disturbing something that desperately wanted to remain hidden. The work was frantic and grim. The smell of freshly turned earth mingled with the strange, sickly sweet scent of the chapel, creating a nauseating perfume. After digging down about 2 feet, their fingers hit something hard. It wasn't the soft resistance of a shrouded body. It was wood. Brushing away the remaining dirt, they uncovered a series of rough-hewn planks, forming a makeshift lid or trapdoor. A rusty iron ring was set into the center of the plank. With a shared, grim look, they gripped the ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavy, but it lifted with a groan of protest, revealing a dark, gaping maw leading down into the earth. A crude ladder was propped against one side, descending into absolute blackness. A gust of cold, foul-smelling air rushed up from the hole, carrying with it the scent of rot, mildew, and something else, a sharp chemical odor that burned their nostrils. It was the smell of death, but not of simple decay. It was the smell of secrets. Sheriff Brody, being the man in charge, knew he had to be the first to go down. He took a deep breath to steady his nerves, grabbed a lantern, and began his descent into the hidden cellar beneath the widow's chapel. The darkness swallowed him whole. The men above watched the circle of lantern light shrink and then vanish, leaving them alone in the horrifying effigy room, waiting in a silence that was now deafening, the strange humming having abruptly stopped the moment the trapdoor was opened. They waited, their rifles pointed at the black hole, for what felt like an eternity, every second stretching into a minute. Finally, a sound came from below. It was not a call for help or a cry of discovery. It was the sound of Sheriff Brody retching, a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated horror. The horrifying sounds from the cellar spurred the other men into action. One by one, they descended the rickety ladder, their lanterns cutting through the oppressive darkness. The cellar was not large, a cramped, root-choked space carved directly out of the earth. But its contents were vast in their implications, a library of calculated evil. Sheriff Brody was on his knees, his lantern dropped to the floor, its light casting a sickly yellow glow on the scene. There were no bodies. The truth was infinitely more disturbing, more macabre. Along one wall were shelves lined with dozens of glass jars, each containing carefully preserved specimens of local flora, mushrooms of every shape and color, roots, berries, leaves, and flowers. Each jar was meticulously labeled with the same spidery script from the journal upstairs. Brody, in his research, recognized some of the names: belladonna, hemlock, foxglove. These were not the ingredients of folk remedies. They were the tools of a master poisoner. On another wall hung bundles of drying herbs, filling the small space with their potent, acrid smell. But it was the central table that held the most horrifying secrets. Spread across it was a detailed map of Hemlock's Notch, drawn with incredible precision on a piece of tanned deer hide. It showed every homestead, every field, every creek, and every path. But there were other markings, too. The Hawthorne and Blackwood properties were circled in red, with intricate notes written in the margins detailing their wells, their livestock pens, and even the locations of their children's play areas. It was a battle map. The curse was not a supernatural event. It was a meticulously planned and executed campaign of psychological and chemical warfare. The journal found upstairs confirmed their worst fears. It was not a book of spells, but a diary of revenge. In its pages, Elara Vance had documented her entire plan. The fire that killed her husband and child, the community had called an accident. But Elara believed it was arson, an act of malice by Thomas Hawthorne and Jedediah Blackwood, who wanted her land. With no proof and a community that already ostracized her, she had no recourse in the law. So she had turned to her own, far darker form of justice. As the men absorbed the horrifying truth in the cellar, they realized the full, terrifying scope of Elara's revenge. The journal was a cold, methodical confession. She had used her profound knowledge of the forest's hidden poisons to orchestrate every single tragedy that had befallen the community. She had induced Jedediah Blackwood's madness with a powerful hallucinogenic fungus, likely introduced into his food or drink, causing the terrifying visions of songs from the soil. The blighted crops, the deformed livestock, all the result of carefully administered toxins, introduced into their wells and feeding troughs under the cover of darkness. She had cultivated the community's superstition, using their fear of witchcraft as the perfect cover for her crimes. The strange symbols, the rumors of chanting, it was all a calculated performance, a grand piece of macabre theater designed to make her victims believe they were being hunted by a demon, when the real monster was a woman armed with a brilliant, twisted mind and an encyclopedic knowledge of botany. The disappearance of Sarah Hawthorne was detailed in the most chilling, detached prose. Elara had lured the child into the woods, not with a spell, but with a sweet-tasting, sleep-inducing flower. The final, horrifying entries detailed the abduction of the entire Hawthorne family. She had used an airborne sedative, a powder blown through a crack in their cabin wall to render them all unconscious in their sleep. Then she had taken them, one by one. The journal did not say where. It did not describe their fate. The final entry was written in a hurried, frantic hand, dated the night the posse had formed. It simply read, "The fools are coming. It is time to join my family in the quiet earth." The curse is now complete. The implication was terrifying. Had she murdered the Hawthorns and then taken her own life, hiding their bodies somewhere deep in the unforgiving wilderness? Or did it mean something else? As the men reeled from these revelations, one of the Fenwick brothers let out a shout from the back of the cellar. He had found something behind a stack of old crates. It was a tunnel. A narrow, dark passage just big enough for a single person to crawl through, leading away from the cellar and deeper into the earth, reinforced with rotting timbers. She hadn't killed herself. She had an escape route. Elara Vance had vanished. The discovery of the escape tunnel confirmed that Elara Vance was not just a poisoner and a kidnapper, but a brilliant strategist who had planned for every contingency. She had orchestrated a flawless campaign of terror, and then, when the time came, she had executed a perfect disappearing act. The tunnel led deep into the sprawling, unmapped wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. To follow her would be suicide. She knew this land, its secrets, its hidden paths, and its dangers. She had become one with the wilderness that the settlers so feared, using it as both her weapon and her shield. Sheriff Brody and his men emerged from the cellar, their faces pale and their minds reeling. They had found the truth, but the truth was in many ways more terrifying than the fantasy of witchcraft. The evil that had destroyed Hemlock's Notch was not a demon or a spirit. It was a human being, driven by a grief that had festered into a cold, calculating, and infinitely patient hatred. They were dealing with a ghost of a different sort, a phantom who was still very much alive, out there somewhere in the vast, dark woods. The posse had a decision to make. What would they tell the few remaining families? What would they write in the official report? To tell the full truth would be to admit that a lone, outcast woman had single-handedly dismantled their entire community through sheer cunning and poison. It would be an admission of their own vulnerability, their own foolishness in mistaking calculated murder for black magic. The story of a supernatural curse, in a strange way, was more comforting. It was an external, otherworldly force that could not have been stopped. but the truth was a story of human evil, which was far more intimate and disturbing. In the end, they chose to burn the chapel. They brought up the jars of poison, the horrifying effigies, and the damning journal, and they piled them all in the center of the room. They set it all ablaze, a desperate, futile attempt to purge the land of its taint. The structure went up in a furious conflagration, the flames lighting up the storm-tossed sky, consuming the evidence of Ilara Vance's macabre genius and leaving only ashes and secrets behind. The burning of the widow's chapel was the final act in the tragedy of Hemlock's Notch. When Sheriff Brody and his men returned to the settlement, caked in mud and smelling of smoke, they brought with them a story that was a carefully edited version of the truth. They spoke of the witch's profane altar, of the effigies, of her sudden, unnatural disappearance. They omitted the details of the poisons, the map, the journal, and the escape tunnel. They allowed the legend of the curse to stand, because the truth was too complex, too shameful, and too terrifying for a community that was already broken. The story they told only accelerated the exodus. The remaining families, hearing that the witch had vanished but was not confirmed dead, wasted no time. Within a week, the last wagon rumbled out of the valley, leaving Hemlock's Notch utterly and completely abandoned. The fields grew wild, the cabins began to rot and collapse, and the forest slowly, patiently began to reclaim the land that had been taken from it. The name Hemlock's Notch became a forbidden word in the surrounding counties, a name synonymous with a dark and disturbing cold case that was never solved. It became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to frighten their children into obedience. "Stay out of the deep woods," they would say, "or the widow of the Notch will get you." The fate of the Hawthorne family was never discovered. No bodies were ever found. They, along with Ilara Vance, had been swallowed by the wilderness, becoming permanent figures of macabre folklore. Sheriff Brody filed his official report, a document filled with ambiguity and unanswered questions. He mentioned the abandoned settlement, the missing families, and the suspected foul play at the hands of one Ilara Vance, presumed deceased or fled. The case was officially closed, but for Brody, it would remain open for the rest of his life, a haunting testament to his failure to stop a monster hiding in plain sight. The valley fell silent, holding its secrets under a blanket of leaves and time, and for over a century, no one dared to disturb its slumber. The story of Hemlock's Notch and the curse of the widow's chapel should have ended there, fading from memory into the obscure annals of forgotten frontier history. For generations, it did just that. The valley where the settlement once stood became known as Sorrow's Hollow, a place shunned by hunters and loggers, who spoke of a palpable coldness and a feeling of being watched whenever they ventured too close to the old, overgrown paths. The forest grew thick and impenetrable, erasing almost every trace of the community that had once dared to tame it. The story survived only as a ghost story, its details warped and exaggerated over time until it bore little resemblance to the horrifying factual events. Ilara Vance was transformed from a cunning poisoner into a supernatural entity, a spectral witch who haunted the hollow, eternally searching for more children to steal. But history has a way of resurfacing. It has a memory, and it often leaves clues buried in the earth, waiting for a future generation to uncover them. This channel is dedicated to unearthing those forbidden histories, to piecing together the macabre cold cases that time has tried to forget. If you want to ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the darkness of the past, take a moment to subscribe. The support helps us continue to dig up these stories that have been deliberately banned from our collective memory. Because the story of Hemlock's Notch was not quite over, a new, disturbing chapter was about to be written, more than 150 years after the chapel burned. A discovery would be made that would suggest the evil born in that valley did not die, and that Ilara Vance's curse was far from finished. The silence of the hollow was about to be broken, and the secrets it had guarded so jealously would once again see the light of day. In the late 1950s, the Tennessee Valley Authority began an ambitious project to survey and map the remote, untouched regions of the Appalachian Mountains for potential dam and reservoir locations. A team of surveyors was dispatched into the area that included the long-abandoned, nameless valley once known as Hemlock's Notch. The team, equipped with modern tools and a healthy dose of mid-century skepticism, knew nothing of the land's dark history. To them, it was just another stretch of dense, uninteresting wilderness. As they hacked their way through the undergrowth, they stumbled upon something that wasn't on any of their maps. It was a series of low, moss-covered stone piles, arranged in a roughly rectangular shape. It was the foundation of a small building. After clearing away some of the brush, they identified the remains of a collapsed hearth and a stone-lined well. They had found the ruins of one of the old settlement's cabins. Intrigued by this unrecorded historical site, the survey team began a more thorough search of the area. They found the remains of several other cabins, their locations matching the crude map that Sheriff Brody had seen in the widow's cellar a century and a half earlier. They were, in effect, rediscovering the ghost town of Hemlock's Notch. They documented their findings, treating it as a fascinating but unremarkable archaeological curiosity. A forgotten pioneer settlement, nothing more. But one of the younger surveyors, a man named Arthur Fleming, was drawn to a particularly secluded and overgrown hollow, a place where the woods felt older and darker than anywhere else in the valley. It was there, while taking measurements, that he found the distinct, charred remnants of a foundation that was different from the others. There was no collapsed chimney, and the footprint was smaller. It was the site where the widow's chapel had been burned to the ground. The soil here was still dark and ashy, even after all this time. It was a scar on the land that had never fully healed, and it was near this scar that Fleming would make a discovery that would resurrect the old, macabre legend in the most chilling way imaginable. Arthur Fleming was a history enthusiast, and the discovery of the ghost settlement fascinated him. While his colleagues were focused on topography, he found himself examining the ancient, gnarled trees that surrounded the charred foundation in the dark hollow. He noticed something odd on the bark of a massive, ancient oak tree that stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought they were natural markings, but upon closer inspection, he saw they were man-made. They were carvings. Faded and weathered by time but still discernible, were a series of strange, primitive symbols, spirals, stick-like figures with elongated limbs, and a recurring symbol that looked like a weeping eye. They were not Native American in origin, nor did they resemble any pioneer markings he had ever seen. They were deeply unsettling, exuding a sense of ancient, purposeful malice. Fleming photographed the carvings and took rubbings. Back at the project's base camp, he did some research, cross-referencing his findings with county records. It was there that he first came across the official, sanitized report of Sheriff Brody from 1802 concerning the abandonment of a settlement called Hemlock's Notch. The report was brief and vague, but it mentioned a suspected witch and a profane structure in the woods. Fleming's heart pounded. He knew he had found the location of the legend. But the most disturbing part of his discovery was yet to come. While most of the carvings were clearly very old, covered in moss and faded almost to obscurity, he had noticed a few that were different. On a younger tree closer to the path was another set of the same symbols, but these were fresh. The cuts into the bark were clean, the wood beneath still pale. He estimated they could not have been more than a few years old. Someone in the modern era had come to this forbidden, forgotten place and carved the witch's ancient symbols into the trees. It was a chilling realization. Was it simply a local prankster, someone who knew the old ghost story? Or was it something more? Did someone still practice the dark traditions born in this hollow? The idea that Alara Vance's legacy was not just a memory, but a living, breathing thing was a deeply horrifying thought. The discovery of the fresh carvings deeply unsettled Arthur Fleming. It transformed his historical curiosity into something that felt more like a paranormal investigation, a modern-day cold case. He became obsessed with the story of Hemlock's Notch, spending his evenings digging through dusty county archives, searching for any document, any journal, any letter that might shed more light on the events of 1802. Most of the records were gone, lost to time and courthouse fires. But he eventually unearthed a treasure, a box of personal effects from the Brodie family, which had been donated to the local historical society decades earlier. Inside, tucked away in a small, leather-bound pouch, was Sheriff Brodie's personal, unofficial journal. It had never been seen by the public. The journal was a revelation. In its brittle, yellowed pages, Brodie had written down everything he had omitted from his official report. He detailed the cellar, the poisons, the meticulous map, the confession in Alara's diary, and the escape tunnel. He wrote of his conviction that Alara Vance was not a witch, but a woman of fearsome and terrible genius, a monster born of sorrow. The journal confirmed that the curse was a hoax, a cover for a brilliant and horrifying revenge plot. But it was Brodie's final entries that were the most chilling. He wrote about the carvings on the trees around the chapel site, describing them in detail. Fleming's blood ran cold as he read the description. It was a perfect match for the symbols he had found and photographed. The weeping eye, the spirals, the stick figures. They were Alara Vance's signature, her personal coat of arms. Brodie also wrote about the low, humming sound in the chapel, a phenomenon he could not explain. He theorized it was not supernatural, but perhaps some geological or acoustic anomaly in the hollow that Alara had expertly used to enhance the terrifying, otherworldly atmosphere of her chapel. He described it as a song from the soil, the very phrase the maddened Jedediah Blackwood had used. The journal was the missing piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocked the true, macabre history of Hemlock's Notch. It was a story of human evil, not supernatural power. And yet one question lingered, a question that the sheriff's rational account could not answer. Who was carving the symbols now? Armed with Sheriff Brodie's long-lost journal, Arthur Fleming felt a responsibility to share the true story. He believed that exposing the events as a series of calculated murders, rather than a supernatural curse, would demystify the legend and put the ghosts of Hemlock's Notch to rest. He wrote a detailed article, combining his own findings with excerpts from the journal, and submitted it to a regional historical society's publication. He expected it to be a sensation, a major correction to a piece of local folklore. The response was not what he anticipated. The Historical Society refused to publish the article. They claimed it was too speculative, too gruesome, and that it relied on an unverified private journal. The subtext, however, was clear. They did not want to resurrect this dark chapter of local history. The story was better left as a ghost story, a harmless fable. To present it as a true story of a brilliant female serial killer who outsmarted and destroyed an entire community was too disturbing, too raw. It hit too close to home. The local people who knew the legend were even more resistant. They dismissed his findings outright. To them, the story of the Witch of Sorrow's Hollow was sacred. They preferred the version with a supernatural villain. It was simpler, cleaner. It kept the evil at a safe, fantastical distance. Fleming's insistence that the monster had been one of them, a flesh-and-blood woman, was seen as an attack on their heritage. He was accused of stirring up trouble, of disrespecting the dead. The story of Alara Vance and her curse was, in effect, banned. The community actively suppressed the truth, choosing to cling to the legend. They did not want to believe that a woman, driven by grief, could be capable of such cold, calculated, and successful evil. The legend of the curse was not just a story. It was a shield, protecting them from a far more intimate and unsettling horror. Fleming, disillusioned and somewhat unnerved by the hostile reaction, eventually abandoned his efforts. He locked away his research, the photographs, and his copy of Brodie's journal. The truth of Hemlock's Notch was once again buried, this time not by leaves and time, but by the deliberate choice of a community that preferred a comfortable lie to a horrifying truth. The story might have ended there, with the truth suppressed and the legend reigning supreme. But the fresh carvings in the woods remained an unanswered, deeply disturbing question. If the locals were so committed to the supernatural version of the story, who among them would be replicating the symbols of the real-life murderer, Alara Vance? The symbols described in Brodie's journal were her secret signature, the emblem of her very human campaign of terror. Their reappearance suggested something more sinister than a simple prank. It suggested the existence of a student of her work, a keeper of the flame. Perhaps Elara Vance had not been working alone. The journal, for all its detail, was written from her perspective. Could there have been an accomplice, someone within the community who felt the same burning resentment towards the Hawthorns and Blackwoods? Maybe one of the disaffected families, like the Fenwicks with their land disputes, had secretly aided her, their descendants now carrying on the tradition. Or perhaps the truth is even more macabre. Could Elara have had a secret apprentice? A child, perhaps, who watched and learned her dark arts of poison and manipulation before vanishing into the wilderness with her. This line of speculation opens up a horrifying possibility that a hidden tradition of vengeance, a secret society of the dispossessed, has been quietly living in the shadows of the Appalachian Hills for generations, using the legend of a supernatural curse as the perfect cover for their own acts of frontier justice. The fresh carvings would then not be a tribute, but a warning, a sign that the curse is not over, but merely dormant, waiting for a new target. This possibility transforms the story from a historical tragedy into an ongoing threat, a legacy of human evil that has been passed down through the bloodlines of the valley. The idea of a Vance curse takes on a new, more terrifying meaning. It's not a spell whispered into the wind, but a methodology, a grimoire of poison and terror, handed from one generation to the next. Let us entertain another, even more disturbing possibility. The Journal of Elara Vance mentioned her desire to join my family in the quiet earth. Everyone, including Sheriff Brody, assumed this was a poetic reference to her own impending death or disappearance. But what if it was literal? The Hawthorns were taken from their home alive. Their bodies were never found. The cellar beneath the chapel did not contain a grave, but a workshop and an escape tunnel. The tunnel led into one of the most extensive and unmapped cave systems in North America, a labyrinth of subterranean passages that stretches for miles beneath the mountains. Is it possible that Elara did not simply flee through the tunnel, but that she had prepared a new home for herself and her family deep within the earth? The macabre image is almost too horrifying to contemplate. A brilliant, insane woman leading her sedated captives into the perpetual darkness of the earth to live out their remaining days as her prisoners in a sunless kingdom. In this scenario, the Hawthorns were not murdered but collected. They became the living exhibits in her museum of revenge. This theory, while wild, would account for the complete lack of bodies. It would also explain the strange, resonant humming that Brody and his men experienced. Such acoustic phenomena are common at the entrances to large cave systems. Perhaps the song from the soil that drove Jedediah Blackwood mad was not just a symptom of poison, but the real sound of the vast, hollow earth beneath his feet, a sound Elara had learned to harness as a tool of psychological terror. If this theory holds any water, then Elara Vance did not just vanish into the wilderness. She descended into a subterranean hell of her own making. The fresh carvings, then, could be the work of her descendants, a family line that never left the valley, but simply moved underground, an isolated, subterranean clan who occasionally surfaced to leave their mark on the outside world, reminding the land above that they still exist. A horrifying, troglodytic legacy of a curse born in a widow's grief-stricken heart. The enduring power of the Hemlock's Notch story lies in its ambiguity. It is a perfect, dark, historical cold case, a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. We are left with Sheriff Brody's rational account of a human monster and the community's terrified insistence on a supernatural one. The truth likely lies in the blurry, terrifying space between the two. Elara Vance was undoubtedly a brilliant and ruthless woman who used poison and fear as her weapons. But the sheer success of her campaign, the way every element of nature seemed to bend to her will, leaves a lingering sliver of doubt. The unexplained humming, the perfectly timed blight, the way she seemed to command the very fear in men's hearts. It's easy to see how even a rational mind could begin to wonder if she had tapped into something more than just botany. Perhaps she was not a witch who made a pact with a demon, but something far older. Perhaps she communed with the land itself, with the raw, ancient, and amoral intelligence of the wilderness that the settlers were so desperate to pave over with their piety. In the folklore of the Old World from which many of these settlers came, there are tales of such figures. Women who could speak the language of the forest, who knew the secrets of the quiet earth, and who could call upon its power to protect their own. In this light, Alara Vance becomes a more complex and terrifying figure. She is not just a vengeful widow, she is an avatar of the wilderness itself, a violent, defensive reaction from the ancient land against the incursions of the civilized world. Her chapel was not an altar to Satan, but a temple to the untamed earth. Her curse was not a spell, but the forest's own immune response, and the hawthorns and blackwoods were the infection it was trying to purge. This interpretation does not absolve Ilara of her horrifying acts, but it reframes them, making her an agent of a power far greater and more terrifying than simple human malice. It suggests that when you push the wilderness too far, it will eventually, and horrifyingly, push back. The modern-day legacy of Hemlock's Notch is one of silence and avoidance. The land is now part of a state forest, but the valley itself, Sorrow's Hollow, remains conspicuously off-limits. Official maps show it as an area of unstable geology and difficult terrain, a bureaucratic excuse to keep people out. Park rangers and local hunters know the truth. The place is considered bad luck, haunted, banned. The story of the Witch of the Hollow is still told, but it's a local secret, not something shared with outsiders. The historical society that rejected Arthur Fleming's article still holds his research, locked away in their archives, a truth too disturbing to be made public. Sheriff Brody's journal remains a private family artifact, its explosive contents known only to a select few. The story has been effectively and deliberately buried. Yet the questions linger. The fresh carvings that Fleming discovered in the 1950s have been periodically rediscovered by the few who dare to venture into the hollow. A ranger in the 1980s reported seeing them. A lost hiker in the early 2000s took a blurry photograph of one of the weeping eye symbols. It seems that every generation, someone returns to that charred patch of earth where the chapel once stood and renews the macabre markings. Who is this person, or persons? Is it the descendant of an accomplice, carrying on a secret tradition? Is it a member of a subterranean clan, the horrifying legacy of Alara's descent into the earth? Or is it simply a local who is so deeply enmeshed in the legend that they feel compelled to keep it alive, to tend to the memory of the witch as one would tend to a grave? This last possibility is, in its own way, just as creepy. It implies that Alara Vance's curse has achieved a form of immortality. It no longer needs her to exist. It now lives in the minds of the people, a self-perpetuating legend so powerful that it compels them to participate in its rituals, to keep the fear alive. The curse has become a living story, a piece of folklore that actively resists being solved or forgotten. Ultimately, the tale of the Widow's Chapel serves as a horrifying reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. The people of Hemlock's Notch believed their faith and their community made them safe, that they had successfully carved out a small pocket of order from the chaos of the wilderness. But all it took was one broken heart, one brilliant, vengeful mind, and a deep knowledge of the Earth's hidden weapons to bring their entire world crashing down. Alara Vance did not need supernatural powers. She exploited the weaknesses that were already present, the community's rigid piety, their suspicion of outsiders, their deep-seated fear of the natural world, and the simmering grievances and resentments that existed between neighbors. She held up a mirror to the darkness that was already inside them, and they called the reflection a witch. She was a master of psychological warfare. Her greatest weapon was not poison, but narrative. She crafted a story of a supernatural curse and then played her part so perfectly that everyone believed it. She made them the authors of their own destruction. Their paranoia, their accusations, their mob mentality, it all served her purpose, isolating her victims and allowing her to operate with impunity. She turned the community's strength, their shared faith, into their greatest vulnerability. It's a chilling testament to the power of a single, determined individual to dismantle a society from the inside out. This is perhaps the most macabre lesson from this dark historical cold case. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones that come from hell, but the ones we create ourselves, forged in the fires of grief, injustice, and revenge. These human monsters walk among us, hiding behind the masks of normalcy, and their curses are not spoken in incantations, but in whispers of poison, in carefully planted seeds of fear, and in the slow, methodical execution of a horrifying, unforgettable plan. The narrative we have constructed here is based on the fragments left behind, a sanitized official report, a suppressed private journal, and a chilling archaeological discovery. It is a plausible explanation for a series of horrifying and mysterious events, but we must acknowledge that it is only one interpretation. The true, complete story of what happened in Hemlock's Notch died with its residents. The voices of the Hawthorns, the Blackwoods, and of Alara Vance herself are lost to time. We are left to piece together the shadows they left behind. Is it possible that Sheriff Brody was wrong? Could his rational explanation of a poisoner be his own attempt to impose order on something that was truly incomprehensible? Perhaps the humming sound was more than an acoustic anomaly. Perhaps the symbols were more than a signature. Maybe the folk tales and the community's terror were closer to the truth than the sheriff's logical deductions. This is the space where history becomes macabre. It is the space of doubt, where the line between fact and folklore blurs, where the possibility of the truly inexplicable cannot be entirely dismissed. The story of Alara Vance is so terrifying precisely because it works on both levels. As a story of a human monster, it is a chilling case study in criminal genius and revenge. As a story of a supernatural entity, it is a horrifying tale of ancient powers and a curse that can erase families from existence. The fact that we can never be entirely sure which version is the true one is what makes it a perfect piece of dark history. It forces us to confront the possibility that our understanding of the world is incomplete, and that there are dark corners of the past where logic fails and only dread remains. The files on Hemlock's Notch may be closed, but the case, in our minds, remains disturbingly, terrifyingly open. Let us consider the final, chilling image of this story. The escape tunnel, a dark passage leading from a cellar filled with poison and hate into the deep, unknown recesses of the earth. It is a powerful metaphor, but it was also a real, physical place. That tunnel is likely still there, its entrance now buried under a century and a half of soil and leaf litter. What secrets does it still hold? Did it simply serve as Alara's escape route to some other part of the country, where she lived out her days under a new name? A quiet, anonymous old woman with a horrifying past? Or is the more fantastical, more macabre theory true? Is it the entrance to a hidden world, a subterranean kingdom where the descendants of Alara Vance and perhaps even the Hawthorns still live, their humanity warped by generations of darkness and isolation? This is the kind of question that transforms a historical account into the stuff of nightmares. The idea of a hidden, uncontacted clan living beneath the mountains, a human echo of the events of 1802, is a profoundly creepy concept. It suggests that the past is not always past. Sometimes it is merely hidden, living and breathing just beneath our feet. The fresh carvings take on an even more sinister light in this context. They are not just a memorial or a prank. They are trail markers. They are messages left by a people who know the secret ways of the Hollow, a sign to others of their kind, or perhaps a warning to outsiders that this is their land, a forbidden place guarded by a curse that is all too real. It ensures that the mystery of Sorrow's Hollow will never be fully solved, that it will remain a place of dark speculation, a blank space on the map where our deepest fears about what lies hidden in the wild places of the world can run free. The story of the Widow's Chapel is a stark lesson in the danger of ostracism and the terrifying power of a narrative. Before Alara Vance was a monster, she was a victim of a tragic fire, and then a victim of a community that chose to fear her rather than comfort her. Her grief was deemed unnatural, her knowledge of herbs was labeled witchcraft, and her isolation was treated as proof of her guilt. The people of Hemlock's Notch, in their piety and fear, created the very monster that would eventually destroy them. They pushed a grieving woman to the absolute edge of her sanity and humanity, and in doing so, they unleashed something far more terrible than any demon they could have imagined. Her revenge, though monstrous and unforgivable, was a twisted reflection of the judgment they had passed on her. They accused her of being a witch who stole children and drove men mad, so she became a witch who stole children and drove men mad, using science and psychology instead of spells. She gave them the devil they so desperately wanted to believe in. This is a recurring theme in the dark annals of history, the accused becoming the accuser, the victim becoming the victimizer. The cycle of violence, once started, is nearly impossible to break. The curse that erased the families of Hemlock's Notch was not born in Alara's chapel. It was born in the hearts of her neighbors. The chapel was merely the place where it was given form, where a woman's profound sorrow was meticulously sharpened into a weapon of horrifying, unforgettable vengeance. The story is a reminder that the seeds of our own destruction are often planted by our own hands, in the fertile soil of our own fear and prejudice. So what remains today of this horrifying tale? Sorrow's Hollow is still there, a silent, brooding patch of wilderness in the heart of the Tennessee mountains. The trees that witnessed the curse still stand, their bark holding the faint, weathered scars of Alara Vance's symbols. The foundation of the chapel still lies beneath the forest floor, a charred memory of a profane altar. And somewhere, deep in the archives of a small historical society, the research of a man named Arthur Fleming gathers dust, while a leather-bound journal written by a long-dead sheriff rests in a family home, its terrible truths still largely unknown to the world. The story of Hemlock's Notch has become a ghost, a whisper on the wind. It exists in that macabre space between history and legend, a cold case that can never be truly closed because its perpetrator vanished from the face of the earth, and its victims were erased so completely that they left not even a grave behind. The tale has outlived its players, becoming a permanent fixture of Appalachian folklore, a story that serves as a stark warning about the darkness that can fester in isolated places, both on the map and in the human heart. It is a story about the terrifying potential of a single human mind when pushed past the breaking point, and the fragility of a community built on a foundation of fear. The silence that hangs over Sorrow's Hollow today is the same unnerving silence that greeted Deputy Miller in the Hawthorne cabin all those years ago. It is the silence of erasure. A silence that speaks louder than any scream, a testament to a curse so potent, so macabre, that it did not just take lives. It wiped an entire community and its dark, horrifying secrets off the map. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the curse of the Widow's Chapel is the question of legacy. Did Alara Vance's evil die with her, or did it, in some form, survive? The periodic reappearance of her carved symbols in the hollow is a chilling testament to the story's refusal to stay buried. It suggests that her methods, her narrative of vengeance, have been preserved. Whether this is through a hidden bloodline, a secret society, or simply through the sheer power of the legend itself, the result is the same. The curse remains active. It has become a permanent, malevolent feature of the landscape. This is the ultimate horror of the story. Alara Vance achieved a kind of dark immortality. She transformed her personal grief into a timeless legend, an eternal engine of fear. She has become a boogeyman, a folk demon, but one who was, at her core, terrifyingly human. Her story serves as a dark grimoire for anyone who feels wronged, outcast, and pushed to the edge. It is a blueprint for how to turn the weapons of a community, its fears, its superstitions, its secrets, against itself. The tale is not just a recounting of a historical tragedy, it is a living, breathing warning. It cautions us that the line between victim and monster is razor-thin, and that the deepest, most unforgiving wilderness is not the one made of trees and shadows, but the one that exists within the vast, unmapped territory of the human soul. The curse of Alara Vance may have ended for the Hawthorns and the Blackwoods in 1802, but the story, and the horrifying possibilities it represents, will continue to haunt the dark hollows of our collective imagination forever. The final, lingering thought is one of profound, unresolved dread. Somewhere in that valley, the truth of the Hawthorne family's fate remains a secret. Did Alara Vance grant them a quick, merciful death, or did she subject them to a prolonged, horrifying end in the dark places of the earth? We will never know. Their final moments are lost to history, a permanent, gaping hole in the narrative. And what of Alara herself? Did she find peace in her revenge, or did her all-consuming hatred eventually devour her as well? Did she live out a long life in some distant town, a quiet old woman with the ghosts of an entire community weighing on her soul? Or did she, as her final journal entry suggested, truly join her own lost family in the quiet earth, her bones now mingled with the soil of the wilderness she knew so well? These are the questions that make this story a true macabre masterpiece. It offers no easy answers, no comforting resolution. It simply presents a series of horrifying events and leaves us to ponder the darkness that lurks behind them. The widow's chapel is gone, its ashes long since scattered by the wind. The settlement of Hemlock's Notch has been swallowed by the forest, but the story remains, a chilling ghost that wanders the desolate landscape of American folklore. It is a testament to the fact that some crimes are so profound, some mysteries so deep, that they can never truly be solved.